Make your choice, adventurous stranger. Strike the bell and bide the danger. Or wonder till it drives you mad. What would have followed if you had? Welcome back, everyone. Being in isolation and seeing the nice weather coming back has made me quite nostalgic lately. So I thought I would do a new series of reviews of books that I read growing up when I was a kid. Some of these books I haven't read since I was either really young or a teenager or somewhere in between those things. So I'm looking forward to going back and reading these and seeing how my opinions have changed of them over time. The first series I'm starting with is one that really had a special place in my heart growing up, partly because of a very strange, looking back, BBC adaptation of these books. But that series is the Chronicles of Narnia. It was one of my favourites growing up, so I'm looking forward to going back, seeing how I think about it now, and once I've done all of them, I may even do a ranking video as well. I plan to do these with some other books that I read as well when I was growing up, so Harry Potter probably at some point, also his Dark Materials, and maybe even a series of unfortunate events, although that is a lot of books, so I don't know that I'd get through all of them. But those are some of the ones that I'm thinking of, so let me know in the comments if there are any of those series that you'd like me to do or focus on in the future. I will get to them. Okay, so today I'm focusing on the first book in chronology of the Chronicles of Narnia, that is The Magician's Nephew. Part 1, Summary. The Magician's Nephew follows two children, Diggory and Polly, who meet while playing in adjacent gardens in a row of terraced houses. The two decide to explore the attics connecting the roofs of the houses, and in doing so, they stumble upon Diggory's Uncle Andrew's study. Uncle Andrew flatters the children and offers Polly a yellow magic ring, which transports her to another world. Andrew then tells Diggory that he must go after her and bring her back, using a green magic ring, otherwise she will be left there. Diggory does so, and he and Polly end up in the woods between the worlds, a dimension that contains portals to all other worlds. Diggory and Polly end up in the city of Charn, where Diggory awakens the evil Queen Jardis, who returns with them to England. After causing mayhem in London and taking Uncle Andrew as a slave, Jardis is taken out of the world by Polly and Diggory, along with Andrew, a cabbie, and his horse. The party find themselves in an empty world, the world of Narnia, at the moment of its creation. Part 2, Back to the Beginning. The Magician's Nephew is the sixth book in the series in terms of publication order, but in terms of chronology it is the first book of the series, starting, as the summary suggested, at the beginning, the creation of Narnia. The book was inspired by a friend of Lewis's asking him why the lamppost was there in Narnia, and this got Lewis thinking about the backstory, the reasons for these things, and that is where the story originally began. Not only do we get a backstory on that, but we also get a more significant backstory about Narnia and its creation, and also the White Witch, who is in this novel known as Jardis. If you're not familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia series, then I would recommend reading The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe first, and then coming back to this maybe after you've read even the whole series, or maybe just before you read the last book. I say this because the last chapter of this novel, the way it's written suggests that the reader would be aware of things that happen in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. There's lots of obvious winks and nods, and it's clearly the narrator saying, remember that book that you read, here's some things that are connected to that book. Although, if like me you've read it already, then I would just do them chronologically because it really doesn't matter all that much. In terms of the backstories to Narnia and to all those stuff, the only thing, and this is where the novel does fall short a bit for me, the only thing that really interested me or gripped me was hearing about Jardis, or the White Witch, and having her backstory. I remember even when I was a kid being really fascinated by this place, Charn, this ruined city, and hearing the White Witch's story about this battle with her sister, and she speaks this word that destroys the city and all this stuff, and I really wanted a book on that, this place, because you don't know all that much about Charn and its culture. You just hear this stuff from the White Witch, Jardis, and it would be so cool to know more about that. And even reading it now, it was the bit of the novel that really struck me when they're in Charn and they meet Jardis for the first time and she's talking about her backstory. I found that way more interesting than any of the other world building, the creation of Narnia, all that stuff. Also, even though she might be a one-dimensional villain, I've always liked the White Witch as a character. Again, that could partly be because of that BBC adaptation. In fact, the woman who plays her is just so theatrical and ridiculous. I might even put a clip of it if I can find it.
A door. A door from the world of men. I have heard of such things. This may recall.
He's only one. Easily dealt with. Yet.
But yeah, the character of the White Witch has always just been one of those great villains for me. She's not the most interesting in terms of complex, but she's just fun, she's great. So it was nice to get that backstory in this book. The only other thing in terms of backstory that I really enjoyed was having Diggory's backstory. And that's mostly because, as I'll talk about in the next section, he's a really good character. And he's very interesting in lots of ways. Of course, we do also get the creation of Narnia, and while I do think the creation scene is very beautiful, it's well written, it's magical, it just isn't all that interesting to me to see its creation. I wasn't really all that interested in the lamppost and how it got there, and they're just not really the things that I guess I cared about enough, and the explanations for them weren't particularly amazing either, so I wasn't all that bothered about the general aim of the book, which was to set up a lot of these things for future books. So in that sense, I do wonder how relevant or needed this novel was. Because while it's nice to have that backstory for Jardis, you don't need it, and likewise for Diggory, you don't need it. So I don't really know how integral to the series this book is overall, but nevertheless, I do still think there are some things to enjoy about it. Part 3. Characters. The best thing about The Magician's Nephew for me are its villains and its protagonists. I've already talked about Jardis, the White Witch, but I think that Uncle Andrew is even better as a villain because he's one of those irritating villains that you meet them at the beginning of the novel, you think they're going to be the main villain, you think they're terrifying, and then they actually meet someone who's sadistic and evil, and they just turn into this little bug. And it's really good how Lewis sets that up, and his kind of fall from grace is just it's very funny. He's a very funny character. Also, a fun fact, Uncle Andrew is based on a schoolmaster at Lewis's school, and Lewis said, during his time there I guess, that he would make a great villain in a story, and lo and behold, here we have Uncle Andrew, a great villain in a good story. I also enjoy the central relationship between Diggory and Polly. For those of you that have read the series, they might remind you a bit of Eustace and Jill, who are the protagonists of The Silver Chair, also two of my favourite protagonists from the series overall. I think part of the reason for that is because there are fewer of them, there's just 2 as opposed to 4 in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. So they have a bit more time to develop and build a relationship together, which is harder to do the more protagonists that you have. Lewis does a really good job of capturing the kind of volatility with these 2 of childhood friendships. One moment they're helping each other, the next they're squabbling and they're crying and they're fighting and all this stuff. He does a really good job of capturing that vitality of childhood friendships. And I think that's one of the reasons why I really liked these books when I was a kid, because it really felt like these were real children, as opposed to a lot of books that, maybe try and make children out to be heroes greater than they actually could be. Specifically with Diggory though, one thing that I really enjoyed about him is how many shades there are to his character. There are certain things that he does in the novel that make him seem like he might be like his Uncle Andrew, or he might grow up to be his Uncle Andrew. Bearing in mind that both of them are academic men when they grow up, or Uncle Andrew already is, but Diggory when he grows up will become a professor. It's interesting that Diggory as a character could have gone that way, and we see that in Charm when he rings the bell which awakes Jardis. And it's nice to see that development in his character, because he does have this sort of impulsive, stupid side, and Polly's there to kind of keep him on the the right path. And it's a great bit of character development. And while I wouldn't say that the Chronicles of Narnia are amazingly complex, they are children's books for character development, it's pretty nuanced, I would say, for what it is and how short it is. Part 4. A light and bright style. So I've already read this book and The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and one thing that struck me when I had read them both, and I think, if my memory serves, I also may have thought this in the past, is that The Magician's Nephew is a much funnier and a much lighter novel than the later entries in the Chronicles of Narnia. There are so many jokes and silly scenes, Uncle Andrew's downfall being one. Even Jardis, when she comes to England and she rips up the lamppost and is like parading it around town on the back of a chariot, it just sounds silly, and it comes across as silly in the book, and that to me just seems to be a deliberate thing. It's meant to sort of be absurd and whimsical and silly, and it's hilarious. And that's not something that you get as much in Sid, Lion, and Witch and the Wardrobe, when you have wolves hunting people down and they're going to eat them, and the White Witch is much more intimidating, I would say, in that book, whereas in this book she's somewhat silly and clownish at times. I think there are two reasons for this light style of this book. First, it's not really a book that has or needs to have a serious villain that needs to be overcome, even though that is an element of the plot. It's basically a story about the creation of Narnia, which is essentially a good thing. It's the creation of this magical world, the beginning, and so it makes sense that the novel is going to have a lighter tone because it's optimistic, it's about the creation of this amazing world, as opposed to later books where there's some force trying to destroy the world or something like that. Of course, Jadis is there, but as I said, even she comes across more silly than threatening in this one, and as does Uncle Andrew. Another reason why I think it has this lighter style is because a lot of this story is harking back to Lewis as a child himself. I've already talked about how Uncle Andrew is based on a schoolmaster of Lewis's, but also Polly and Diggory have elements of them that are also based on Lewis. Both of them are bad at maths and struggle with it in the book, and Lewis also had this problem. They were both born, Diggory was born at the same time as Lewis, so the setting and context is something that Lewis is using from his past, from his childhood, and Diggory in the novel has an ailing mother, and this is also something that Lewis had to deal with when he was a child as well. So I think that there's a lot of nostalgia in Lewis's writing because he's looking back mostly fondly on his childhood and his friendships, and he's using that to inspire the book. So I think that's what's responsible for this difference in style. I also think that that is the thing that makes this novel interesting. Again, world building, plot, not so much. It's the uniqueness in the way that it's written, in the lightness of the story, and all of those things, rather than, say, the reason that it was written, which is to have some backstory. Part 5. Genesis and Narnia. The last thing I want to talk about in this video are the biblical references in the book. This is because a lot of people are either put off or dislike the Chronicles of Narnia because of their Christian allusions to Christianity. I'm not a Christian myself, and I never have been, but the Christian imagery in the book doesn't bother me, and I think people who think that these books are somehow preaching a Christian message are not really interpreting the books fairly for the most part. Instead, I prefer to see Lewis as taking inspiration from Christian mythology, which is hardly an original thing. Lots of people take inspiration from religions, and he's using that to tell a story that's grounded or based on that, but not necessarily just preaching it. For those of you, though, that maybe do care about the Christian stuff, I also think it's worth mentioning that that's not all Lewis takes inspiration from. In terms of Narnia itself, with its worship of nature, with beasts talking, and satires and lots of other mythical beasts, Lewis isn't just drawing from Christianity here. He draws on paganism, on folklore, on all kinds of myths to create this world. So it's not clear to me that it is exactly Christian. There are lots of elements that I don't think Christians would like things like magic. And magic isn't always portrayed as necessarily a bad thing, although sometimes, like with Jadis, it is. Probably the biggest Christian nod in this book is the Tree of Life, which is somewhere where Diggory has to go at a certain point, and he has to pick some fruit from it. He has permission to do so, and Jadis is there, and she tries to tempt him to steal the fruit for himself, because it has powers. Now, a lot of people say that Jadis in this context is representing the snake, and I think that's certainly true, and Diggory, I guess, is meant to be kind of in Eve's role. What's interesting about this, though, is that instead of it being a woman who introduces evil into the world, it's a man, it's Diggory. Of course, Jadis is female and she is the evil presence, but she only gets there because Diggory awakens her because he's an idiot, and then brings her into Narnia. So I find that an interesting little subversion and just a nice, interesting divergence from the traditional story. I talk about this biblical stuff because I do think that these books are really worth reading and you shouldn't be put off by the Christian elements of them. There's only really one thing in The Last Battle that bugs me, and that's not really even a Christian thing, it's more just a sexist thing. But we'll get to that on that book. For me, I would really try to go into this with an open mind, to try and see these broader themes that I've mentioned in terms of the biblical stuff, and the fact that he takes inspiration from all kinds of mythologies, even if there is a lot of Christian stuff in there, and also some of the ways that he does things differently from how they're done in the Bible. Part 6. Conclusion. Overall, I think I enjoyed The Magician's Nephew a lot more when I was a kid. I think the main reason for that is because the world building stuff I didn't really notice then, or didn't really care about, whereas now seeing the overall series and knowing why this novel was made, it just seems to me that it is a bit less integral to the series in comparison to the other books. So it does lose some points out on that. I do think some of the explanations for why things ended up how they did in later books was not really that interesting. So on those counts, it kind of lets it down a bit for me. However, I still enjoy the characters, still enjoy the backstory with Jardis, and the style is very distinctive when compared to some of the other books, which can be not like terribly dark either, but certainly not as humorous and light-hearted as this one. So overall, I'd say it's still a good, solid entry in the series, but certainly not the best that it has to offer. Alright, that's it for today's video. Please let me know in the comments what you think about some of the stuff that I've said, especially the biblical stuff, because I like to get people's views on that. I especially like to know from people who do disagree with me and who do think that the messages are just too on the nose. So we can get into some debates in the comments. Feel free to do that because I love a good debate. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and also subscribe to my channel for updates for future videos. I upload once a week, Mondays at 4 PM. That's it for today's video, so take care everyone, stay safe, and I will see you soon.
Next time!